So anyway, a very pleasant afternoon. I am Dr. Radesh. I am a radiologist at Cellara Diagnostics here, very close to your place. This is in Baswangudi, and Ramesh and I happen to be very thick friends. We started our MBBS together in 1982. So anyway, Ramesh I think is busy with I think one of the audits. Okay. So what I'll be doing today over the next say 40-45 minutes is just introduce you to MR, more so about MR physics. Then we will look at normal brain anatomy, how it looks on MR. We will look at the spinal anatomy, then look at a few conditions. And before I conclude, I would like also to show you a few fetal MR cases, two or three of them, because exit procedures are coming in a big way, especially for the pediatric surgeons. One thing here is please interrupt me whenever you want. Okay, you need not hold back the questions till the end. In case you have a doubt, you have a comment, please feel free. So I am audible, right? I'm quite clear.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So this is the MR machine for those like who haven't seen the machine. And the inside the hole, what you see here, the bore is the gantry aperture. This is the table, and the child goes into the magnet. We have different coils to suit, say, from pediatric to adults. And MR means magnetic resonance imaging. Formerly, it was called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, but the word nuclear has been removed. So basically, it is magnetic resonance imaging where we make use of the protons to get an image. So let's look at that as we go by. So basically, for pediatric or neonatal cases, three imaging modalities are important. One is neurosonography. I think you all are aware of neurosonography, where we make use of a high frequency ultrasound around 5 megahertz to look at the intracranial structures. It could be hemorrhage, or it could be some encephalomyelitic changes, or an extraaxial collection can be picked up on neurosonography. When it comes to CT, now, the difference between MDCT and MSCT is just in those alphabets. It's a multi-detector CT, you call it as MDCT, and a multi-slice CT, you call it as MSCT. Both are the same. So initially what we were doing is we were doing a single slice section. But with the advancement of technology, now we have multiple sections. It could be a 64 slice, it could be a 128 slice, it could be a 256 slice, where we get the volume data. But what I feel personally is anything beyond 64 slice, I think is superfluous. By and large, you can do everything with a 64 slice CT. And for pediatric practice, I still feel even 16 slice CT can do everything because 64 slice is basically used for cardiac cases where we do coronary imaging, and rest of the angios, everything can be imaged beautifully with 16 slice CT. And the third thing here is magnetic resonance imaging, where we make use of the protons within the human body to produce an image. So this is the section of, this is an image, sorry, of the CT scan. This is a 128 slice what we have. As I told you, anything beyond 64 actually is superfluous. So where we use CT in pediatric practice is basically to look at trauma, to look at hemorrhages, or it could be craniosynostosis, where we use this to evaluate the sutures, because the 3D what we get is excellent with a multi-detector or a multi-slice CT. The biggest disadvantages of CT are, one is radiation. Though we drop the radiation whenever we image an infant or a pediatric case, but still the radiation is slightly higher. So we should try to avoid as much as possible to irradiate the child. Now, what happens, the fancy is, now we want arterial phase, we want portal venous phase, we want equilibrium phase. So just look at the radiation what the child gets. So it's enormous. So even a coronary gets less radiation sometimes. It may be 6 or 7 millisieverts. But if you start bombarding the child with arterial phase, venous phase, equilibrium phase, then the radiation can go up to 8 or 9 millisieverts. So that is pretty high. So that brings us to the clinical evaluation. Though I am a radiologist, I always say patient first, image next. So all of you postgraduates should be extremely good in your clinical aspect. Once you are so good at it, you exactly know, suppose there is a lesion in the liver, even with your clinical evaluation and also with ultrasound, you know, okay, fine, we are dealing with a hepatoblastoma. So this is the information we need. So we can tailor make the CT so that we can avoid the radiation. The second thing is reaction to iodinated contrast. Okay, we never know who throws up a reaction to iodinated contrast. Now, as far as MR is concerned, higher the Tesla, that is the unit which we use to represent the strength of the magnet, the better the resolution. So you have 0.5T, 1.5T, you have 3 Tesla machines. So the higher the Tesla, better is the resolution. We use coils, the coils which are apt for the fetus, or sorry, not for the infant. We use that. Sedation may be needed. And we also use sometimes gadolinium, which is a paramagnetic contrast. It is not an iodinated contrast. Iodinated contrast is used for CT. Paramagnetic contrast is used for MR. Let's see as we go by, what does the contrast do? So the advantages of MR, you all know this. There is absolutely no radiation. Soft tissue resolution is phenomenal with MR. You can do a multiplanar imaging. You can take an axial, coronal, sagittal, single oblique, double oblique. You name the plane, you can take a section with MR. The limitations of MR are hyperacute bleed. Though I have put this up, but still now we have sequences where we can pick up hyperacute bleed and also we can pick up calcification. We call it as susceptibility weighted imaging. That is something quite new which has come into the practice where you can pick up calcifications, especially in cases of torch. We need not subject the child for CT. We can pick up even calcifications very well on MR. Now, in the current day practice, if you see, there are a lot of kids who have undergone cochlear implants. So, before sending a patient for MR, let it be a 1.5T or a 3T, doesn't matter. Cochlear implants are contraindicated for MR. Second thing, usually you have parents or grandparents accompanying the children for MR or CT. And especially for MR, cardiac pacemakers is a big no. These parents or grandparents cannot enter the gantry room along with the baby. So your task is not just to educate the parents but also the grandparents. Now let's look at the physics of MR over the next 10 minutes. Let us look at physics and let us also look at how the structures, common structures or normal structures look like on MR. Now, if you look at this hydrogen proton, H plus is a hydrogen proton, and human body is made up of 90% water. So water constitutes 90%. Then you have muscles, which again have some water. You have fat, you have bone. So bone does not have much of protons. So 90% of the protons are there in the fluid, viscera, and also in the marrow, bone marrow. So now what happens? When the child is made to lie within the bore of the magnet, this BO is an external magnetic field. So what is external magnetic field? The magnet itself constitutes the external magnetic field. It could be 1.5 Tesla, it could be 3 Tesla, it doesn't matter. So the external magnetic field is always present when the magnet is magnetized. You cannot shut off this magnetic field. And on a 3T machine, it is around 30,000 times powerful than the Earth's magnetic field. So that is why you should be extremely careful not even to take a small coin inside, because it can rocket inside and injure the baby. So you should be very careful. So once the baby is made to lie within the bore of the magnet, the hydrogen protons which are there within the infant or the patient, it aligns along the external magnetic field, which is produced by the magnet. There is a magnet, so there is a magnetic field, what we call as the external magnetic field, and then the hydrogen protons within the body of the patient start aligning along the external magnetic field. Is it clear, or any other way that I should be explaining? Please feel free. Absolutely. This is a completely informal session. Okay, you can treat me as Ramesh only. Okay. Can I continue? Is it clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So these hydrogen protons align along the external magnetic field. But this alignment will not produce any image. So what do? We give a radio frequency pulse. The RF pulse is given to the hydrogen proton. Once we hit the hydrogen proton with a radio frequency pulse, this proton will tip down. This is here. This will tip down into the horizontal plane. So now in physics, we have learned whatever protons or the energy, if you take, energy cannot be destroyed. Energy can be dispersed. So what happens similarly, the hydrogen protons which acquire this radio frequency energy, they tip to the horizontal plane, but they cannot remain in the horizontal plane. So what happens? They give off the energy slowly to the adjacent protons and come back to equilibrium or their original state. And when they are coming back to the equilibrium, there is an antenna which captures these signals and converts them into an image. So that is the simplest way we can explain how an image is formed on MR. I'll just recap it in 10 seconds. There is an external magnetic field. Within the bore of the magnet, you have the patient. The patient's body is made up of 90% water. Water is H2O. So you have H component or the hydrogen, which aligns along the magnetic field, which does not produce an image. Then we bombard the hydrogen proton with radio frequency pulse. Hydrogen proton tips to the horizontal plane, and when it is coming back to the equilibrium, the signals are captured by an antenna, which converts this data into an image, and that is what you finally see. So it's a very complex procedure. Now, this pulse parameters, I will not go much into this. Directly, I'll go to something where you want to know what is T1, what is T2. Okay. So now we will look at the images. Forget the physics part of it. Short TR, short T, it's all for us. You need not scratch your head. You just need to know what is a T1 weighted sequence, what is a T2 weighted sequence. I'll show those images also for you. So when we look at the T1 and T2 weighted sequences, there are certain terminologies which we put in our report, which you would have seen. We will say, okay, this T1 weighted images show a hypointense lesion, which turns hyperintense on T2 weighted images. So hypointense means black. Isointense is similar to brain parenchyma, and hyperintense is white. So you will see this. I'll show you the images. So now let's look at this. Now look at this dark structure. It's a T1 weighted image. I'm sorry. This is a T1 weighted image. The CSF is black. So whenever you see black CSF in the brain, it is a T1 weighted sequence. Is it clear? Okay, to put it very, very simply, it is T1 weighted image where you see the CSF as black. Now, if you look at a T2 weighted image, the CSF will be white. So white CSF means T2 weighted, dark CSF means T1 weighted sequence. Now, let's look at a few structures around it. This is CSF within the ventricle, but if you look at the scalp fat, the fat is looking white. You see the fat within the neck, it is looking white, but the CSF is looking black, CSF is looking black. So there are certain structures which can appear white or hyperintense on T1 weighted images, which you should not mistake it for abnormality. The first and the foremost is the fat which appears white. Second, subacute hemorrhage. It is extracellular methemoglobin. Whenever there is a bleed in the brain, if you see it as a white structure, you can always age the bleed, or there could be a temporal evolution of the intracerebral hematoma. And if you see it as a white structure within the brain parenchyma on T1 weighted, you know this is subacute bleed because it is extracellular methemoglobin. And I was talking about gadolinium. Gadolinium is a paramagnetic substance. Now, what does gadolinium do? When we inject gadolinium, similar to iodine for CT, this gadolinium reduces the T1 of the tissue. Now, whenever there is a T1 reduction, T1 is a value which can range from 10 to 500 or 600. And if there is a reduction in the T1 value, then you start seeing it as a white structure. Now, fat has a small T1, subacute hemorrhage has a short T1, paramagnetic agent has a short T1, and sometimes if you see a cyst containing proteinaceous substance, it can also appear white. So these are 4 or 5 things which can appear white or hyperintense on T1 weighted sequence. Please don't mistake fat for an abnormality. If there is fat in unusual locations, yes, we know it could be a dermoid. We look at an example of dermoid also, and or it could be a lipoma. Similarly, if you look at T2, T1 shortening becomes structure becomes white. T2 shortening, the structures become dark or black. Normally, CSF is white, and the other structures which can be black, not white, on T2 weighted images are acute hemorrhage, it could be hemosiderin, or it could be iron. If you look at basal ganglia, okay, it can appear dark because of the iron deposition within the basal ganglia, which can still be physiological. It is not pathological. Now let's look at one more or two more sequences here. These are critical for you, especially it could be pediatrics, it could be pediatric surgery, it doesn't matter. So we'll just go back now. T1, CSF looks black, fat looks white. I'm just adding small points here. T2, CSF looks white, fat does not look so white as T1, it is but still white. And look at the sequence. CSF is looking white, fat is suppressed. This is called as T2 weighted inversion recovery sequence. Inversion meaning we have suppressed the signal of fat. These are the orbits. You can see the optic now, you can see the perioptic CSF space, but the retrobulbar fat is completely suppressed. So this sequence you need to know, T2 weighted IRFSE. So where do you use it in pediatric surgery? I think that is important. So T2 weighted IRFSE sequences are basically used to evaluate optic nerves. Second is retinoblastomas. Now, is there an extension of the retinoblastoma? If you just do a T2 weighted sequence, the fat can merge with the retinoblastoma extending along the optic nerve. So you may miss some part of the tumor. So if you do a fat suppressed sequence or a T2 weighted IRFSE sequence, you will pick up the lesion very well. This is called as the FLAIR sequence, fluid attenuated inversion recovery. Here we have suppressed fat, here we have suppressed CSF. Actually, this is a T2 weighted sequence, but look at the CSF. CSF is dark like T1. So but look at the brain parenchyma. It appears more grayish. We go back to T1. T1 looks more white. That is how you differentiate a T1 from a proton density sequence. So sorry, a fluid attenuated inversion recovery sequence where CSF is dark. Now again, this can be used especially when we look at multiple sclerosis. FLAIR sequences are extremely good when we look at MS plaques. The next sequence is the gradient echo. I think these five you have to know: T1, T2, fat suppressed, CSF suppressed, and T2 star is done to evaluate hemosiderin. Whenever there is a lesion on the CT, you don't know whether it is blood or not. Take the patient in for MR, do a gradient echo sequence. If there is blooming, this is hemosiderin. So you know that this is blood. Diffusion weighted sequences are used basically for infarction, number one. Second, to differentiate arachnoid cyst from epidermoid. And that is very, very important. So you have to differentiate epidermoid from arachnoid cyst. When you do a diffusion weighted sequence, if there is if it turns white, if there that means there is restricted diffusion, there is cytotoxic edema, and this is called as ADC maps, which is exactly the reverse of diffusion. Now let's look at one more case of this is a diffusion weighted sequence where there is no restricted diffusion. So this is not an infarct or this is not an epidermoid. We know that this is an arachnoid cyst. So you can characterize the lesion when you do a diffusion weighted sequence and differentiate epidermoids from arachnoid cysts. Now, so this is regarding the physics part of it. Can we take a 2-minute question? If there is any question on this, or if you haven't understood something, or if you have a comment, please go ahead. Because I always say there cannot be a stupid question, there can always be a stupid answer. So if there is a problem, there will be a problem from my side, not from your side. So it's clear? Can I go ahead?
Yes, sir. I think so. It's clear, sir.
Okay. Please feel free because See, actually, I don't know if it is for pediatricians, it would be easy because there are a lot of conditions we can speak on. But for the pediatric surgery group, it should be surgical related. But this is just a brief intro to the physics of MR, the anatomy. So now let's look at the anatomy here. This is a T1 or a T2 weighted sequence. CSF is black, fat is white. So is it T2 or T1?
T1, sir. T1.
T1, excellent. So it's a T1 weighted sequence. Here it is T2 because the CSF is white. Now, this section here, the first image, is an infratentorial region. You have the petrous temporals here, which are black. Now, why are petrous temporals black on MR? Because petrous temporals do not contain hydrogen protons. And MR cannot see anything apart from hydrogen protons. So if you see a black structure, say a bone or a flowing blood also looks black because they have very, very little protons. So this is the right left cerebellar hemisphere, and then you have the medulla in the middle. This section shows the fourth ventricle in the midline. Anterior to that is the pons. One cut above shows you a heart-shaped structure. This is the cerebral peduncle on the right, cerebral peduncle on the left, right-sided tectum, left-sided tectum. And for pediatric surgeons, you might see cases of hydrocephalus. I'll show you one case where it could be aqueductal stenosis or it could be a tectal glioma, which can cause aqueductal stenosis and obstructive hydrocephalus. So this section is through the midbrain. Posteriorly, on either side of the falx, you see occipital lobes. This is the superior cerebellar vermis, right tentorial leaflet, left tentorial leaflet. This is the temporal lobe on the right, temporal lobe on the left, and frontal lobes. Now, what would have been taught to you maybe is just draw a line along the frontal horns. Anything anterior is frontal, anything posterior is temporal or parietal. So it is not so, right? Because we need to look at the central sulcus. Anything anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. Posterior to the central sulcus becomes the parietal lobe, where you see the sylvian fissure and the opercula, that is the temporal lobe, and then you see the occipital lobe posteriorly. So this is T1. Similarly, on T2 weighted sequences, I've just put almost the same images here, just to give you an idea how it looks. If you look at the gray matter on T1 weighted images, it looks gray. White matter looks white. This is the white matter. This is centrum semiovale, and this is the gray matter, cortical. Now, on the T2 weighted sequence, it becomes reversed. The gray matter starts looking gray or white, and the white matter appears dark. You see, this is the frontal white matter, you have the anterior limb of internal capsule, posterior limb of internal capsule. This is the external capsule, thalami on either side of the third ventricle here. This is the lentiform nucleus on either side. Between the external capsule and the internal capsule, you have the lentiform nucleus. Then you have the head of the caudate abutting the frontal horn, the right caudate nucleus, the left caudate nucleus. So these are all deep gray matter. You have the superficial gray matter, and then you have the deep gray matter. So we just looked at T1 weighted sequence on the axial and T2 weighted sequence again on the axial. Now, if you look at the sagittal plane shows the corpus callosum very well. If there is a corpus callosal lesion, it could be a pericallosal lipoma, or it could be a corpus callosal, it could be a demyelinating plaque, it could be a glioma. The best section would be the sagittal to look at the corpus callosum. Similarly, you can look at the pituitary gland very well on the sagittal. You see a small bright speck here where I pointed out the arrow. That is the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is hyperintense on T1 weighted because of the secretions which are there. If you don't see hyperintensity of the pituitary on T1 weighted sequence, it indicates either an ectopic posterior pituitary or diabetes insipidus. So for diabetes insipidus, I think this is a wonderful investigation. Just one sagittal T1 can show the posterior pituitary. Similarly, you have coronal sequences. This is a coronal through the frontal horn. The midline structure is the third ventricle. And as you go posteriorly, you start seeing the body of the lateral ventricles and the cerebellar hemispheres. And coronal shows the tentorial leaflets very well. This is the left, this is the right tentorial leaflet, which is very well seen. And again, to evaluate the optic nerves, coronal stir sequence. What is stir? Short term inversion recovery. I showed you the images where you suppress the fat. You just see the optic nerves, the perioptic space very well. So basically, you have axial, coronal, and sagittal sequences. So these three form the foundation for any diagnosis. Now let's look at the spinal anatomy. I've just brought about a single midline section here. This is the cervical, dorsal, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Now this is a T1 weighted sequence. Now why do I say it is T1? Because the CSF is black, the fat is very white, and it's a T1 sequence. Similarly, T2 weighted shows the CSF to be bright, the fat less bright than that of the T1 weighted sequence. So one midline section can beautifully evaluate the craniovertebral junction. You have the anterior arch of the atlas, you have posterior arch of the atlas here. This is the odontoid. This is the body of C2. So this is the craniovertebral junction. Then you have the clivus coming down anteriorly. Then the cervicomedullary junction can also be clearly evaluated on the sagittal sequence. You have the medulla here, then you have the cervical cord. And this protruding structure above the medulla is the pons. Above that, you have the midbrain. So you can look at the pons, you can look at the medulla, the cervical cord dorsal, and you can look at where the cord ends very well. That is the region of the conus, and then you have the chorda equina going down. So this midline gives you most of the informations whenever you're dealing with. It could be a Chiari 1 malformation, Chiari 2 malformation. The sagittal sequence is extremely important because it gives you most of the information. These are the axial sections on the right. This is cervical region where you can see the nerve roots very well. You can see the spinal cord. In fact, you can see the anterior horns here of the anterior horn cells. You see the bright structures here on the right and the left. These are anterior horn cells. These are the roots. These are the foramina through which the roots go out. This is the dorsal. You can see the dorsal cord here, which is looks slightly smaller than the cervical. And then you have the lumbar. This is the disc level. And anterior to that, you have the aorta, inferior vena cava. And this is the dural sac. And these are the nerve roots, multiple nerve roots, which is the chorda equina. Let's look at a few illustrations here. This is a case of Dandy Walker malformation. And in Dandy Walker malformation, we all know there is a large posterior fossa cyst. The posterior fossa is enlarged, and you have a small cerebellum. The cerebellar hemispheres are small. You have Vermean hypoplasia, and this cyst communicates with the fourth ventricle, giving rise to hydrocephalus. You can see dilated right ventricle, dilated left ventricle. This is the optic recess of the third ventricle. The third ventricle also in this section it has not come, but you see the dilatation of the third ventricle here on the sagittal, and you see the optic recess going down into the sella. So you can pick up these lesions extremely well on MR, and you can beautifully plan your surgery now looking at these images in different planes. Now, this is a child again with hydrocephalus. You can see dilated. This is more of colpocephaly, where you have dilatation of the occipital horns of the lateral ventricles. Now, let's look at a case of aqueductal stenosis. I'll just go back on one sagittal image again. Okay, so we will look at this. See, this is the tegmentum. This linear structure is the tectum. Between them is the aqueduct. So we know that. So we know where the aqueduct comes in the region of the midbrain, and that communicates between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Now, when there is an aqueductal stenosis, you don't see the aqueduct at all. Then you start seeing dilatation of the third ventricle. You also see dilatation of the lateral ventricles. So quite a common condition. So what do you people do? Now you know there is an aqueductal stenosis, but you have to open up an alternate pathway for the CSF to flow out and get absorbed. Now let's just run this. Now this is a flow study where you see the flowing CSF. This is a patent aqueduct. So you see the flow in the aqueduct. So you see the flow here. Let's look at the axial. This is the aqueduct. You see the flow within the aqueduct. So there is no aqueductal stenosis. But if you take a case of aqueductal stenosis, if you see carefully the first image here, the sagittal image, the aqueduct is open superiorly. The white structure is the CSF, and then there is a small band going across. This is a web within the aqueduct, which has caused aqueductal stenosis, and there is dilatation of the ventricular system. So, what have you people done? You have gone through the floor of the third ventricle and created an alternate pathway. Third ventriculostomy is what has been done. And you see a black structure here. This is the pons, the black structure is the basilar artery, and you can see the flow going anterior to the basilar artery. So, whenever there is a flow, you see it as a black structure on MR, like a jet. So this is a black jet going from the floor of the third ventricle into the prepontine cistern anterior to the basilar artery. Now let's see this. If you carefully see this area here where I'm pointing out, that is the flow of CSF through third ventriculostomy. So you can assess the flow through third ventriculostomy. So you also know whether the third ventriculostomy is working or not. So let's play it again. You see this black structure. This is the pons. This is the basilar artery. Anterior to that is where you see the flow. So you see the flow. This is a child with aqueductal stenosis, third ventriculostomy done, and you can see the flow across the third ventriculostomy. Now, this is again a common condition where you keep on operating day in, day out. There's a meningoencephalocele. Why this is an occipital meningoencephalocele? Why do you call it meningoencephalocele? You all know that you have the meninges containing the CSF and also the dysplastic cerebellum here going into the sac. And you see elongation of the tectum because the cerebellar hemisphere along with the tent is going inside the sac and the tectum is being pulled. Now CT, we can do a CT, we can tell you what is the size of the defect so that you can plan your surgery, take out the meningoencephalocele along with the dysplastic cerebellum. And we can also do a contrast study which gives an idea about the venous system. What has happened to the dural sinuses? Have they become a part of the sac or they're lying separate? So it's important for us to interact. I think it's very important, especially postgraduates. I always keep telling there is absolutely no ego. Just pick up the phone, call the radiologist. And I always tell the radiologist in my talk, pick up the phone, talk to the clinician. See, ultimately, the best should go to the patient. So you know what surgery to do, you know what to plan, and the information is critical which we can give. So I think the interaction is extremely important. So we can also do a CT in this in these kids and see what is the defect so that you can plan how to close the defect. Now, one thing which is tricky is especially frontonasal cephaloceles. Okay, along the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, you'll start seeing a mass within the nasal cavity, and then you think that yes, it could be a polyp sometimes, but sometimes you could be proved wrong. It'll be a cephalocele. So it's important we do an MR. We can look at the herniation of the frontal lobe here on the sagittal plane. Same thing here on the coronal plane. You can see the herniation of the frontal lobe. So this is a frontonasal cephalocele. Just one illustration of a stroke, how it looks like. I told you diffusion weighted images show restricted diffusion, so the infarct starts appearing white. That is diffusion weighted sequence, but this is not does not have much importance as far as as pediatric surgical practice is concerned. More of neurology than neurosurgery. Now infections. This is classical neurocysticercosis. You see small ring enhancing lesions post-gadolinium. But this was interesting. There was a small cyst at the outlet of the fourth ventricle blocking the foramen of Magendie. So you see have the foramen of Magendie in the midline. This is blocking the foramen of Magendie. In fact, you can see a small scolex inside. You see a black dot, that is the scolex, and there is hydrocephalus because of the obstruction. So this is an intraventricular cysticercosis. This is neuroparenchymal cysticercosis. On CT, you see them as small specks of calcification, which are all dead larvae. When a larva is dying, it gives rise to edema, but once it is dead, you see it as calcifications. Okay, you have the, in fact, Escobar classification for cysticercosis. Now, corpus callosal agenesis with lipoma. As I told you, you can see the corpus callosum very well on a sagittal. Now, here you don't see, but you start seeing the bundle of Probst. The Probst bundles are here along the frontal horns. Then you have the fat T1 hyperintensity. It should be fat. It should be extracellular methemoglobin. It should be gadolinium. So it is not so. So there is no GAD here. There is no blood here. Now, how do you say there is no blood? We have also done a fat suppressed sequence. So if they ask you in the exam, how do you know that this is blood? How do you know that this is fat, not blood on a T1 weighted sequence? You say we do a fat suppression sequence, which is a STIR, STIR, or an IRFSE, inversion recovery sequence, which will suppress fat. So have we done that? Yes, we have. So this is a fat suppressed sequence where the fat is suppressed. If it was blood, it would not have got suppressed. It will still remain white. Is that clear? So now we know this is corpus callosal agenesis with a lipoma. Now let's look at this. This is an arachnoid cyst. Oh, how do we know it's arachnoid cyst? We have done a diffusion. This is T1. You see a large cyst. T2 hyperintense, T1 hypointense, diffusion, no restriction. If there was restriction, I'll close my eyes and say it's epidermoid. There is no differential. If there is no restriction of diffusion, this is arachnoid cyst. Now, how does porencephalic cyst look like? Now you will say that, okay, this is T1 hypointensity, T2 hyperintensity. We know it's a cyst. Okay. And then whether is it arachnoid or porencephalic? How do we know? Suppose we don't have the history of an insult to the brain. How do we differentiate? Do a FLAIR sequence, fluid attenuated inversion recovery sequence, which is a T2 weighted sequence, but you have suppressed the fluid. The CSF is suppressed here, but you start seeing a hyperintense line along the cyst, which tells you this is gliosis. So whenever there is a cavity containing CSF marginated by a gliotic area, it is a porencephalic cyst. Though it looks like arachnoid, flare sequence differentiates the two. Tumor, this I just brought it up to show you how spectroscopy looks like. And there are three things what you need to remember in spectroscopy. NAA, which is N-acetyl aspartate, CR is creatine, CHO is choline. So in MR spectroscopy, when we evaluate tumors, we do not, we, or you can say spectroscopy is a non-invasive biopsy. So spectroscopy gives you the information about the parameters, the chemical parameters which are there within the tumor. Now, if the choline level is high, it is malignant. If the choline level is lower than NAA, this is NAA. So if the choline level is low, if the NAA is high, it is not tumor. If the choline is high and the NAA is low, it is tumor. Because there are a lot of breakdown products within the tumor which causes elevation of choline. So elevation of choline, tumor. This is for you. Now let's look at one small kid here. There is a swelling on the nose. Now you have diagnosed this. It's a dermoid cyst with a dermal sinus. But the important beauty of MR is where is the tract going? This is the information we have to give you. And you can see this is the sinus. Sorry, this is the cyst, what we saw here on the nose. And this is the tract. And this tract is going posterior superiorly to the base of the anterior cranial fossa. But you start seeing this black line still separating this tract from the epidural space. So there is no intracranial extension. So that is why I think imaging is so critical for you to plan the surgery like in all these cases. So this is a cyst and this is the tract and there is no intracranial extension. Chiari malformation, you all know this. There is inferior displacement of cerebellar tonsils. There is enlargement of the spinal cord and you see this black area within it, which is syringomyelia. So this is a Chiari 1 malformation with syringomyelia. Is it clear? So here, midline sagittal section, it's so important. And whether you ask or not, again, it's our duty to complete the study, look at the whole cord, because we never know till where the syrinx is extending. If we just do a cervical, we may miss out the dorsal syrinx. So we have to do the entire spine in such kids. Chiari 2 malformation. Important thing is you have a molar tooth sign here, something like a Joubert syndrome. In Joubert's also you get a molar tooth sign, you have a large massa intermedia, you have a fenestrated falx. The falx should be seen as a black line in between, but you see these interdigitations here. This is very classical for a Chiari 2 malformation. Plus, these kids also have cervical or cervicodorsal meningoencephalocele or meningoceles. Unlike a routine myelomeningocele, which is normally seen in the lumbar or the lumbosacral region, Chiari-2 malformation kids have it higher up in the cervical or cervicodorsal regions. Now, in diastomatomyelia, again, one take-home message here is whenever you suspect you see a scoliotic patient, okay, you think this child has a diastomatomyelia, also ask for CT sections. Sometimes what happens is the thickness of the bony spur cannot be very well made out on MR. This is the CT myelo which is done. You can see the thick bony spur in between. So to evaluate bony spurs, the best investigation is CT. But please do an MR and ask for CT sections also, because MR can tell you what is the size of the split cords, whether the cords are of the same size or different. You know where the split is starting, you know where the split is ending. And also, you can evaluate if there is syringomyelia within one of the hemichords. Now, this is a child with lipomyelomeningocele. Now, why lipo? You look at the T1 weighted. CSF is dark. There is a white structure here, which is the fat, and there is enlargement of the dural sac, and the cord is tethered to the lipoma. So this is basically still intrasacral. You're not seeing anything coming out through the posterior element defect. So this is a lipomyelomeningocele, which is very well contained within the sacral canal and the cord being adherent to the lipoma. Now, this child again is a lipomyelomeningocele because the cord is entering the sac. The sac contains CSF, which is hypointense on T1. The sac contains fat, which is hyperintense on T1. And this child has a lipomeningocele. There is no fat within the sac, only the cord is going in. In fact, you can also evaluate when you do a high resolution and see if there are any roots also which are lying within the sac. I think this is one of the last slides here as far as this presentation is concerned, and then we will go to see 2 or 3 slides on fetal. So this was a very interesting case we had, okay, of spinal dysgraphism, where you see a split cord here and you see something in between. So this was a diastometamyelia. Now this is sagittal. You see the cord ending lower down and you don't see continuity of the sacrum. So first we thought, could it be sacral agenesis? Because the midline, you have to see sacral segments, you have to see coccyx, which you are not seeing here. Then when we did the coronal, see this carefully. These are, sorry for the quality because these are quite a old case. In fact, Ramesh had sent this. I don't know whether he remembers or not. Okay, this we did it, I think, around 20 years back. So this is the right side of the vertebral column. This is the left side of the vertebral column. So there is a split. The whole vertebral column is splitting. We did a CT also. Have a look at this. It looks like a mirror image. There is one vertebra here, one vertebra sitting next to it. So this was an extreme case, and in fact, this child had the rectum going between the vertebral, if I can call it two vertebral columns, one on the right, one on the left, and in between there was the rectum which was exiting out. So this is an extreme case. So the last 2 or 3 slides here, I think we have to start, especially for the pediatric surgeons, now with lot of exit procedures coming up. I think next 5 to 10 years, you people will be operating on all fetuses. Okay, you won't be pediatric surgeons, you'll be fetal surgeons. So this was a child with fetus with corpus callosal agenesis. You don't see the corpus callosum at all. This is the frontal horns, colpocephaly on either side, and this is the bundle of Probst. So corpus callosal agenesis. This was a child, the fetus with encephalocele, occipital encephalocele. You can see the defect so well. Sacrococcygeal teratoma in a fetus. So these are a few things like tumors, which probably you can look at operating in utero. So friends, with that, I would like to just conclude. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity and thank you for your attention. And please, any questions, feel free. Okay, I think we have time, 5-10 minutes. We can always discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Radesh, for a very nice talk. Excellent talk it was. Um, maybe we should have one more talk with you talking to us about chest and genitourinary and gastrointestinal tracks where more interesting MRI pictures and studies will be
Correct.
there.
Sure, sure, sir.
So,
Sure.
yeah, that will be very instructive to us. We should have one more talk scheduled by you on, this tumor.
I think
One we
more of
should probably
surgical
restrict to tumor
conditions
pathology,
we have to look
tumor
at.
pathology, one to thoracic, and one to probably GI and GU. So maybe 2 or 3 talks we need to schedule from you when you have
I
the
think
time.
we will do it, sir. I will
Yeah,
do
yeah.
that.
Now they are talking about this environmental friendly MRI. I just read it in some news report. Is it true that helium is very environment unfriendly? Is that true?
What is unfriendly, sir?
The helium which you use for MRI.
He,
I mean, you need
sir,
to.
helium as such, yeah. But what is happening is it is such a tightly sealed container into which they pour the helium.
Hmm.
So there is not even, say, 1 cc of it which leaks out, sir.
Correct. But once you
But for the
discard the
environment,
scanner,
yes. For
once
the
you discard the
environment,
scanner,
yes,
what
sir.
to do with that helium?
So what they have done now, sir, if you look at all our scanners now, this helium is not let out. So
Okay.
it is recycled. So
Okay.
what we do is we get the helium filled once in 3 years, 4 years. Initially, it was every 6 months.
Okay. So is there a helium-free MR available now in the future? Are they
Helium-free
working on
MR,
it?
no, sir.
No.
Only thing is they
Okay.
are doing something they're working on because for superconductivity, helium is needed. Now they are
Okay.
working on something like room temperature superconductivity. So they can do away with the helium.
Okay. Right. And also the power of the machine is increasing every year. 7,
Absolutely, sir.
10,
So now the
14 and all
current
they're
thing,
talking
what we
about.
have is 3 Tesla.
Yeah.
So, see, people usually, whenever we go to a radiology lectures, we say Tesla easy and Tesla crazy radiologists. So, I think it is always better we are Tesla crazy because we have
So in
seen
one of those
amazing.
company emails now, I saw 14 Tesla MRI
Oof,
being talked about
my
by
God.
GE. I think GE is trying to work on that. I think it is still at the R&D stage.
Sir, I have gone into a 70 machine,
Hmm.
but it's impossible, sir. The impact on the vestibular apparatus is so much,
My
you feel
God.
really giddy.
Yeah.
So I think that they need to address as we go up
Correct.
on the Tesla. And
Yeah.
second is peripheral nerve stimulation.
Hmm.
Because for at least the adults, okay. But when we do a pediatric, if the child has some superficial burns, then it becomes a problem.
Correct. So thank you, Radesh. Thank you
So
very
thank
much.
you so
As
much.
I said, we definitely need 2 or 3 more classes from you.
Uh,
So
we
we'll
will
let
we
you
will
know.
do that, sir. I think even I was thinking when I was given this
So
topic,
one talk exclusively for tumors we need, Radesh. Some specific tumors we want you to tell us about. So oncology one talk, then
yes, sir.
thoracic one talk, and
Thoracic, what do you want, sir?
yeah, GI and GU we can probably talk. Those
Okay,
topics we can. We'll let you know when we schedule it.
sure, sir.
Hmm? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.